The drive back from the grocery store took 11 minutes. I know because I counted every one of them. The same way I count everything now that I live alone. Coffee scoops, steps from the bedroom to the kitchen, days since my daughter last called. When I turned onto my street and saw the unfamiliar car parked in my driveway, a black SUV, new, with a vanity plate that read DRKSLVN, I almost kept driving. Then I saw my grandson sitting on my porch steps with a backpack in his lap, and both arms wrapped around it like it might run away from him. I parked on the street and walked toward him without hurrying. He looked up. He had been crying, but he was done with that now. 7-year-olds decide when they're done crying, and then they just stop, like flipping a switch. I always admired that about him. "Hey, buddy," I said. "Hey, Grandpa Walt. Whose car is that?" "Dad's. He's inside." He said, "Wait out here." I looked at my own front door, then back at Mason. "You want a sandwich while we wait?" He nodded. I took him inside through the side gate, through the back door, past the shelf where my wife Eleanor's ceramic roosters still lined up in a row the way she arranged them 17 years ago, and I made him a peanut butter sandwich and cut it the way he liked, diagonally, not straight across, because he'd once told me that the triangle pieces tasted better, and I'd never questioned it. My son-in-law came into the kitchen while Mason was eating. Derek Silvano, 41 years old, recently promoted to regional vice president of something I could never remember the full title of. He was wearing a shirt that probably cost more than my first car. He looked at the sandwich, then at me, and his expression was the one he always wore when he came to my house, the careful, controlled look of a man tolerating something beneath him. "I need a few minutes," he said. It wasn't a question. I nodded at Mason. "Finish up, bud. You can go watch TV in the other room. Channel 47. When Mason was gone, Derek sat down at my kitchen table without being invited and put his hands flat on the surface the way men do when they want to seem reasonable while saying something unreasonable. "I'll get to it," he said. "Claire and I have been talking. We think it would be better for everyone if you dialed back the time you spend with Mason." I got myself a glass of water and stood at the counter. "How much is dialed back?" "We're moving into a different season of life, Walter. Claire's career is picking up. My position comes with obligations, events, dinners, the right kind of associations. Mason is going to be in that world. It's not personal. It's just that your influence and our world are," he paused to find the word. "Different." "Different," I said. "You're a good man. I'm sure you were a good father to Claire when she was young, but that was a different time. Mason is going to need to move in circles where the people around him reflect his future, not his past. You understand." I drank my water. The ceramic roosters watched from the shelf. Outside, a mockingbird was going through its whole repertoire in the oak tree Eleanor had planted the year we moved in. "Does Claire know you're here?" I asked. "This is a joint decision." I didn't answer that. I put my glass in the sink, dried my hands on the dish towel, and walked into the living room where Mason was watching cartoons with his shoes still on because he always forgot to take them off. "Mason, your dad's going to take you home now." He looked up. "Already? I'll see you soon." He hugged me around the middle, the way kids hug completely, without strategy. Then he got his backpack and went to find his father. I stood at the front window and watched the black SUV back out of my driveway. I watched it reach the end of the street and turn, and then it was gone. I went back to the kitchen and sat down at the table where Derek had been sitting. I looked at the rooster shelf for a long time. Then I picked up my phone and called my accountant. What Derek Silvano didn't know about me would have taken him a long time to list, mostly because he'd never tried to find out. He knew I was 64. He knew I'd spent 30 years as a mechanical engineer before retiring. He knew I drove a 2009 pickup truck and wore the same brand of work boots I'd worn since 1987, and that I kept a garden in the backyard that Eleanor had started, and that I'd refused to let go to weeds after she passed. He did not know that for those same 30 years, every discretionary dollar I made beyond what our family needed, vacations, Christmas, college for Claire, I had quietly put into commercial real estate. Not glamorous real estate, not the kind that gets written up anywhere. Old warehouse buildings in secondary markets, light industrial space on the edges of mid-sized cities, strip mall end caps, things nobody wanted until they needed them. Eleanor knew. My accountant, Ray, knew. My attorney knew. My old college roommate Dennis knew, because he'd been my silent partner on the first 4 properties, and then bought out his share when he retired to Florida. That was the complete list of people who knew. I had started small. The first property was a 4,000 square foot former auto repair shop in a town 40 minutes east of where we lived. I paid $62,000 for it in 1991. I leased it to a plumbing company for $900 a month. The plumbing company eventually became a regional distributor, needed more space, and when they left me with a building worth 4 times what I'd paid and a solid credit line at the regional bank where I'd been building a relationship for a decade. I did that again and again. The buildings got larger. The markets got better. When certain types of business parks started expanding in the late 90s, I already owned parcels nearby. When e-commerce started needing fulfillment space in the early 2000s, I already had buildings that fit. I was never the smartest man in any room. I was just patient, and I showed up, and I didn't sell things when people told me to sell them. By the time Derek came to my kitchen to tell me I wasn't the right kind of influence for my grandson, I owned 31 commercial properties across 4 states. One of them was a 22,000 square foot Class B office building in the business corridor 11 minutes from Derek and Claire's house. I had owned it for 9 years. 3 weeks before Derek's visit to my kitchen, that building had been leased for the first time in 18 months to the regional headquarters of the company Derek worked for. His company's name was on the lease. His signature was on the lease. I hadn't known that when we signed. My property manager handled the leasing. I rarely reviewed individual tenants on the smaller properties. I found out afterward, when Ray mentioned it in our quarterly call, laughing a little because he thought it was a funny coincidence. I hadn't laughed. I had just filed it away the way I filed everything quietly, without urgency, trusting that information tends to become useful eventually. The morning after Derek's visit, I called Ray and asked him to send me the full lease file. I want to be honest about something. I am not a man who plots revenge. That's not who I am, and it's not who Eleanor would have wanted me to be. I spent 30 years building things, not tearing them down. I believe in patience and in allowing situations to resolve themselves, and I believe that people who are cruel tend to eventually create the conditions of their own reckoning without much help from anyone they've wronged. But I am also a man who understands leverage. And I knew, looking at that lease file, that I had some. The question was whether to use it. I decided the first thing to do was call my daughter. She answered on the 4th ring. Her voice had the particular quality it took on when she was prepared for a conversation she didn't want to have, careful, slightly elevated in pitch, the way she'd sounded at 12 when she'd broken something and wanted to manage my reaction. "Hi, Dad." "Hi, sweetheart. Did Derek tell you he came by?" A pause. "He mentioned it. Did he tell you what he said?" Another pause. Longer. "He said you two talked about Mason's schedule. I let that sit there." "Claire," I said, "do you remember the summer your mother was sick? The first time, the round of treatments in 2009? Dad, you were 26. You had just taken that job in Phoenix that you were so excited about. And you came home for 3 months, and you sat with her through every appointment, and you drove her home when she was too tired, and you made her soup, even though you'd never learned to cook properly, and the soup was genuinely terrible. But she ate every bowl." Silence. "I am not telling you that to make you feel guilty," I said. "I'm telling you because I know who you are underneath whatever is happening right now. And I need you to think about whether the person you are looks at her father and decides he's the wrong kind of influence." I heard her breathing. "We'll talk," she said finally. Her voice had changed. The prepared quality was gone. "Okay," I said. "Take your time." I hung up and went out to the garden. The tomatoes needed staking. I staked tomatoes for an hour and didn't think about Derek Silvano at all. My son-in-law made his second move 6 days later. He called me himself, which surprised me. He had a different tone this time, smoother, more deliberate, the tone of a man who'd had time to research and had found something he thought changed the conversation. "I know about the building," he said. "Which building is that?" "Don't do that, Walter. The property on Centennial Boulevard. My company's lease." "Okay," I said. "What about it?" "I think we both know there's a conflict of interest situation here. I'm going to need to disclose this to our legal team. It's possible the lease gets voided." I was sitting on the back porch. A hummingbird was working the feeder I kept filled for Eleanor, because she'd loved them, and I couldn't bring myself to take it down. Derek, I said, I didn't know your company had signed that lease when they signed it. My property manager handles the day-to-day. It was a coincidence. That's convenient. It's true. But more importantly, a conflict of interest flows both ways. You signed a lease on a property you had a family connection to without disclosing it to your own company. That's something your legal team might also want to know. He was quiet. I'm not interested in your lease, I said. I've been hands-off on that building since your company moved in, and I'll continue to be hands-off. Your company got a good rate on good space, and I have a signed multi-year agreement that I intend to honor. That's the whole story. Then what do you want? The hummingbird left. A cloud moved and the backyard got warm and bright. I want to see my grandson, I said. The same way I always have. Every other Sunday. Saturday mornings, sometimes when you two need help. Christmas and Thanksgiving like always. That's what I want. It's not complicated. Another silence. Longer. I'll talk to Claire, he said. You do that. Claire called me that night. She was crying before she'd said 3 words. The way she used to cry when she was small, and something had frightened her, and she'd held it together as long as she could, and then finally let it go. I listened. I didn't try to solve it. I'd learned from Eleanor that sometimes the only job is to listen. She told me that Derek had been different since the promotion. She told me that she had felt herself changing too, going along with things she didn't fully believe because it was easier than the argument. She told me that when she thought about what he'd said to me, she felt sick. You don't need to apologize for him, I said. I'm apologizing for me, for not calling, for letting it get to where he thought he could walk into your house and say something like that. Claire, Dad, your mother used to say that marriage is the longest conversation you'll ever have with another person. Sometimes you lose the thread. That doesn't mean it's over. She was quiet for a moment. Did she say that to you at some point? Like, specifically, 1,998, I said. We had a bad stretch. I was working too much. I missed things I shouldn't have missed. You never told me that. It wasn't yours to carry. I leaned back in my chair. Work on your conversation. I'm fine. I'll see Mason on Sunday. She exhaled slowly. He keeps asking about the triangle sandwiches. Tell him Sunday. I want to say Derek changed entirely after that phone call, but that's not how people work. What happened was more gradual and more real than a transformation. He was stiff with me for a while, formal in a way that was its own kind of apology, if you knew how to read it. He shook my hand too firmly at Thanksgiving and refilled my coffee without being asked, and generally acted like a man working hard at something. I let him work. Mason turned 8 in February, and I took him fishing at the reservoir an hour north of town. Just the 2 of us, the way my own grandfather had taken me. We didn't catch anything worth keeping, but Mason caught a catfish that he held up for a photo with both hands and a look of pure animal satisfaction that made me laugh out loud. I have that photo on my refrigerator now, held up by a magnet Eleanor bought at some roadside attraction in New Mexico in 2004. Spring came. The garden came back. I started a new plot along the south fence, something Eleanor had always wanted to try. A cutting garden. Just flowers. Nothing practical. Just color. I dug it myself and I planted it myself, and in June it bloomed so extravagantly that my neighbor Ruth came over the fence to ask what I'd done, and I showed her Eleanor's old notes in the garden journal because the answer was in there, and I was honest enough to admit the credit wasn't mine. Somewhere in there, Derek started coming inside when he dropped Mason off. At first, he'd just stand in the entryway. Then he'd sit in the kitchen while Mason and I finished whatever we were doing. One Saturday in April, he sat at the kitchen table and watched me show Mason how to replace the belt on the old push mower and asked a question that I could tell he'd been working up to for a while. How did you get into real estate? I looked up. He had his elbows on the table, and he was watching with the genuine curiosity of a man who has recently discovered he didn't know something he should have. It wasn't a plan, I said. I had money left over at the end of a month. I didn't trust the stock market. That's probably a character flaw. I don't know. But I understood buildings. I understood what they needed and what it cost to maintain them. 1 turned into 31. Over 30 years, yes. Mason was threading the new belt with his tongue between his teeth, concentrating completely. Derek watched him. I made assumptions about you. he said. He wasn't looking at me when he said it. I know. They were wrong. I know that too. He nodded slowly. The belt slipped, and Mason said a word that he'd clearly heard somewhere and shouldn't have been repeating, then looked up at both of us with wide eyes. Derek pressed his lips together and I looked at the ceiling, and we managed, just barely, not to laugh until Mason looked back down at the mower. The part that I hadn't fully anticipated was the meeting. Derek's company held a regional investor event in June, one of those gatherings that companies put together to show their portfolio to the people whose money sits behind them. It was held in their headquarters on Centennial Boulevard. My building. Derek had invited me, tentatively, almost as a question, a few weeks before. He said there would be people there he'd like me to meet. He said it in the way he'd said things since April, carefully, genuinely, without the varnish of his old performance. I said I'd come. I wore a jacket. Not the jacket Claire tried to get me to buy, which was something with a logo on it that I didn't understand. The jacket I'd worn to my last engineering firm's retirement dinner. Dark gray, still fit, with the one small pin in the lapel that Eleanor had given me at my first professional award in 1989. A small copper-colored compass rose, almost invisible unless you were close. I drove myself in the 2009 pickup. The building was full of people in expensive clothes. There were catered trays and a bar set up in the corner, and a presentation screen at the front of the main conference room. I stood near the back and watched. Derek found me after 10 minutes and brought me into a group conversation with some of his colleagues, introducing me by name only, no context. Midway through the evening, one of the company's senior executives, a man named Hal Gresham, who'd been making the rounds all night with the energy of someone who owned every room he entered, stopped in front of me with a drink in his hand, the look of a man politely trying to place someone. I don't think we've met, he said. Hal Gresham, Executive VP. Walter Crane. And what brings you tonight? Walter. I own the building, I said. He blinked. Once. I'm sorry? This building. Centennial Boulevard. I've owned it since 2015. He looked at Derek, who had gone still. Then he looked back at me at the gray jacket, the old pin, the truck keys, in my jacket pocket. I could see him doing the math, and I could see the moment the math came out correctly. Crane Properties, he said slowly. That's you. That's me. Hal Gresham set his drink down on the nearest table. His expression had shifted completely. The performative authority was gone, replaced by something more real and considerably more respectful. We've been trying to get a meeting with Crane Properties for 2 years, he said. Your portfolio in this corridor is, we've been looking at expansion options, and your holdings are— I know what my holdings are, I said, not unkindly. He laughed. It was a genuine laugh, a little embarrassed. Of course you do. He extended his hand again, differently this time. I'd love to find some time to talk. Properly. Sure, I said. Have your people call Ray Matsuda. He handles my schedule. I shook his hand. Then I went and got a glass of water from the bar and found a spot near the window where the last of the evening light was coming through. Outside, in the parking lot, my old truck sat between 2 vehicles that probably cost as much as the building we were standing in. Derek found me there a few minutes later. He stood beside me and looked out the window, and for a while neither of us said anything. You never mentioned it, he said. All these months. You never once mentioned that you owned this building. It didn't seem relevant, I said. He was quiet for a long time. I watched a young woman outside walking a dog on a leash, the dog zigzagging on the hot pavement, investigating everything. I came to your house and said what I said, Derek said. His voice was lower now. And the whole time, you were the landlord. The whole time, I said. You could have used that. You could have. What? Threatened you? Made things difficult? I shook my head. I didn't want your company out of that building. You have a fair lease on good space. That has nothing to do with you and me. I turned to look at him. I wanted to see my grandson. That's all I ever wanted. And I wanted you to give me that because you understood it was right. Not because I had something over you. He looked down at the floor. When he looked up again, his jaw was tight, and his eyes were the eyes of a man who has recently seen himself clearly from the outside and found the view uncomfortable. I was wrong, he said. What I said to you, all of it, I was. I had gotten so far inside my own head about status and image, and he stopped, started again. Claire told me about the summer of 2009. When her mother was sick, she told me about the soup. The soup was really bad, I said. He almost smiled. She said you told her that. It's true, but she ate it, and she came back the next day and she made it again. That's the part that matters. Derek looked at his hands. I want to be better at this, at being part of your family. I wasn't raised to. He stopped again. I waited. My father wasn't a present person. I didn't have a good example of what a father-in-law is supposed to be, what a grandfather is supposed to be. And when I saw you with Mason, how easy it was, how much he looked for you, I think I resented it instead of being grateful for it. The room behind us was still full of noise and movement. Out the window, the dog walker had gone. The parking lot was turning amber in the fading light. You've got time to fix it, I said. Mason's 8. He's going to need you present and paying attention for a long time yet. I know. And Claire. She's working hard at something. So are you. Don't lose the thread. He nodded. His voice when he spoke was quiet and without any trace of the performance I'd first met across my kitchen table. Walter, I'm sorry. Genuinely. I put my hand briefly on his shoulder, the way my own father used to do, not a long gesture, not dramatic, just a point of contact that said, I heard you. We're still standing. Let's move. I know, I said. That Sunday I picked Mason up at 9 in the morning. He came out the front door in rain boots despite there being no rain, carrying a paper bag that rattled when he moved. What's in the bag? I asked. Rocks. I've been collecting. Good rocks or regular rocks? He considered this with great seriousness. Mostly good. We drove out to the reservoir with the windows down, the bag of rocks on the seat between us, Mason naming clouds in shapes that required significant imagination to confirm. I confirmed them all. We ate the triangle sandwiches I'd packed on the tailgate looking out at the water, and Mason told me about his teacher and about a disagreement he'd had with his best friend about something to do with a trading card that I didn't fully follow but listened to completely. And at one point, he just leaned against me the way children do, without announcement, without ceremony, and we sat like that in the August heat until the sandwiches were gone. On the way home, he fell asleep in the back seat, one hand still loosely holding the top of the paper bag. I drove slowly. I took the long way. Eleanor used to say that some things are too good to hurry, and driving a sleeping grandchild home in a warm truck on a Sunday afternoon is one of those things. I took back roads I hadn't driven in years, past a field I remembered and a water tower painted with a name I used to know, past things that had changed and things that hadn't. When I pulled into Derek and Claire's driveway, Claire came out to the porch. She looked at the truck and then at me, and she raised her hand in a small wave, not a greeting exactly, more like an acknowledgement, like two people passing on a road who recognize each other as travelers going in roughly the same direction. I waved back. Derek came out behind her and reached into the back seat and lifted Mason out without waking him, the way you can only do with children that age, and carried him inside. I backed out of the driveway and took the long way home. The cutting garden was waiting. Eleanor's notes said the dahlias would need deadheading by now, and she was always right about those things, and I'd learned over the years not to argue with what she'd written down. I parked in the driveway and sat for a moment with the engine off, listening to it tick as it cooled, looking at the front of the house. The same house we'd bought in 1988 when neither of us had much of anything yet. The garden Eleanor had put in the front bed was full and overreaching the way she'd always let it get toward the end of summer, spreading past its boundaries, uncontainable, more than it had any right to be. I got out of the truck. I got my gloves from the garage. I went to work.